Thank you so much, Liz. So obviously we've been having some very difficult conversations here, melancholic music to go with. Speaking about journalists who've died, but let's not forget about the ones who are also languishing in jails and those who are suffocating, as we've so clearly heard, under oppressive regimes. And yet, there are those, as my mother would say, who are still possessed and want to join this industry. And so we're looking at the future generation of journalism. What does that mean? How will they speak? And where will they be doing this work? That's coming right up.
All right.
So to kick us off, if you're a journalist, you've probably heard Nick Newman. If not, you've definitely read his work. He's a senior research associate at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, and as I mentioned, is the lead author of the annual Digital News Report, and he will start us off with some trends so that we can root our conversation in facts. Please, a round of applause for him.
Thanks very much. Really good to be here. I hope I have some slides to show you. This is a presentation by an old person about young people. But fortunately, on the next panel, we do have some young people. Yeah, can we bring up the slides? Perfect. Excellent. I'm feeling more confident now. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes outlining 5 key differences in news consumption of younger generations, and in particular, so-called Gen Z, from our Digital News Report 2024, which was published yesterday, but also drawing on some sort of detailed qualitative work we've done talking to young people around the world over many years. So just a reminder that the Digital News Report is the largest ongoing study of news consumption. This year we surveyed 95,000 people in 47 markets, representing around half the world's population. It's based on an online poll, so representative samples as far as possible in each country. It's worth pointing out in a few of the markets in Africa and India, these are really representative of a younger, more educated group, English speaking primarily, so we try and bear that in mind when talking about the results. The survey was conducted on our behalf in January, February this year by YouGov. You can see the range of sponsors there, including the Google News Initiative, many broadcasters, academic institutions too. So, to the 5 key factors. I guess the defining factor of this group of young people is they're not just digital, but they're social first. They grew up with social media. They've never known anything else. They spend a huge amount of time with it. And this makes them, in many ways, the most extreme examples of behaviors that we expect to become much more mainstream in the future. And this chart really shows the dependence that young people have on social media for news. And you can see how they're different from the other groups in terms of news consumption. This is a question we ask about: what's your main source? Do you prefer television? Do you prefer print? Do you prefer radio, online, or social media? And you can see that 18 to 24s really stand out. This group of social natives, 42% say social media across all countries say it is their main source of news, far more than say they go to a mainstream news website or app. Whereas for the millennials in blue, the next generation up, it's a little bit more even. So this group has much weaker connection with traditional news brands. Here's another way of looking at the change. This is data just from our UK survey about the proportion that say they start a news journey with a website or app rather than other access points like social or search. And what we see here is older groups in the blue, over 35s, they haven't really changed their preferences. They still prefer to go directly, or a lot of them do. But if we look at 18 to 24s, you can see this group of social natives coming into our sample much less likely to say they go directly because of that focus on social media. And this is really challenging for news publishers. And you can see the sort of tipping point as they come into the survey in around 2018. But it's not just that they're using social media, it's also that they're using different networks as they come of age. So this chart represents users across 12 countries, and it shows the networks used by 18 to 24s for any purpose. And you can see how this group, as they come of age, have leaned into first Instagram, and then TikTok, and you can see how Facebook has become much less relevant. And that's because the tone, the language, and the formats, which include a lot of visuals, a lot of video, are more in keeping with the expectations of how this generation wants to consume. So this brings me to the second key difference we see in our data, which is about format. So a question we ask in the survey is whether you prefer to read the news online or watch it or listen. And I'm just using German data here, though it's relatively similar in most countries. So all age groups, interestingly, still prefer to read, even younger ones, because you're in control. It's quick to get to the information you want. But 18 to 24s are relatively more likely to say they prefer to watch and more likely to say they prefer to listen. And this, of course, is borne out in the higher consumption we see of podcasts and short-form and long-form video as well. Short-form video usage, as many of you know, is exploding around the world, and it is being driven by this youngest group. So 43% of 18 to 24s, according to our data, use TikTok for any purpose, and news is a much bigger part of that this year than it was last year. It's particularly popular in countries in the global south, again, partly due to the younger populations in these countries. And it's played a big part in elections recently in many countries, including Argentina, where President Milei has a very, very strong TikTok account, in Indonesia, in the EU elections in the last few weeks, with politicians really engaging young people directly on the platform. So these are some of the reasons why people say they like long and short form videos. The sense of authenticity, bringing greater trust. You know, a lot of the videos we've seen from Gaza, for example, recently, that really resonated with young people was for that reason, that sense that there was no spin, that the mainstream media wasn't adding its personal agendas to it. Secondly, convenience. It's partly about how short they are, how easy they are to consume, but it's also about the algorithms that bring you relevant content that is aligned with your personal interests. And then finally, the range of perspectives and often the depth that you can get on these different platforms really resonates too. And then in these video and social networks, we find in this year's report that young people, and Gen Z in particular, are much more likely to access news from personalities, celebrities, or news creators than necessarily traditional news brands. And for the first time this year, we've asked people to tell us who they followed in these networks. And these are just some of the many young news creators across the world mentioned. So Hugo de Crypt in France is a real go-to person now for under 30s. The way they get their news through video. More named overall than traditional brands like Le Monde, for example. TLDR News, which does explainers for young people, by young people, really resonating in the UK. Vita Spihar in the US, who runs a TikTok account called Under the Desk. So she presents the news quite often from under a desk as opposed to over the desk, like traditional TV formats. And in the report, we go into this in much more detail in a detailed chapter if you want more information. So that brings me to the fourth characteristic of Gen Z, which is this broader definition of what news is. So young people have a clear view on what the news is and what it looks like. It's very much associated with those over-the-desk presenters, the traditional formats, and the sorts of stories that are contained within them. So politicians, wars, international conflicts, the sort of thing we've been discussing today. But they're often seen as negative and difficult by young people and things to spend as little time as with possible. But then there's this broader set of subjects which they're really interested in, and it includes a lot more entertainment, sports, celebrity, culture, as well as issues like gender identity, mental health, and social justice, which often don't get sufficiently covered. So Gen Z are actually interested in a huge range of things, but a lot of the time they don't see that in the narrow agenda pursued by traditional media. Which brings me to the subject of news avoidance, which we've talked about for a long time. It's not just young people, but across our survey we find now 39% say they sometimes or often avoid the news, which is a record figure in our data. And this is partly due to that news agenda and many of the open comments you can see there from young people related to fatigue about the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine, the sense of powerlessness that many people feel. And here's somebody in South Africa talking about, much of the news is depressing, it makes me sad and anxious. And if we want to engage young people, we may need to have a hard look at the way in which we cover stories, the way we bombard people with more and more negative news. That brings me to the fifth and final point which comes out of the research, which is that Gen Z and young people are mainly deeply skeptical of information, all information, not just information from news publishers. And that's partly because they've grown up with social media and they kind of assume that people have an agenda. So there is a sort of widespread view that it's impossible to have any objective truth on some of these divisive issues. The skepticism about the motives, political motives or commercial motives. And then thirdly, the sort of heightened awareness that there are groups, because they see them in social media, who actively and purposefully try and manipulate opinions. And all this adds up to the fact that for these people, for young people, very little information is now taken on trust. And this skepticism, of course, is being fueled by a new wave of technological change. We should remember, of course, young people have been exposed to AI for quite some time through algorithms and AI filters, but Gen AI is now bringing synthetic content, fake or manipulated pictures into social media feeds every day, and they worry about their ability to detect what is true and what is false. This idea of seeing as believing is becoming harder every day, and that is contributing to the skepticism, though potentially also an opportunity for traditional publishers. So just a recap of those 5 points, I'm sure we'll discuss them in the panel. So Gen Z are not just digital first, but they're social first, and that affects much of the way in which they interact with news. They're more likely to watch or listen to the news online than older groups. They tend to interact with people with personalities rather than necessarily with faceless news brands. They're interested in this broader set of subjects, including personal passions, and sometimes they look to spend less time with traditional narrow news, and they tend to be skeptical of all information. The range of perspectives they see is often making them confused and anxious, and AI may add to that. Our report is out. It's free to download. It's on our website, so please do explore it, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Back to you, Edith.
Video of what exactly we anticipate to be discussing. Maybe.
I don't think traditional media is going to go away. It remains important, but young people just don't need it as much as they used to.
So how must information be prepared that it is perceived by young people? How do we reach them? Do they still see journalism as a means of defending democracies? To strengthen both, we need young allies. How can we bring all generations to the table? Creative, sustainable, diverse, and young. Are these the new pillars of journalism? Join the discussion.
So there we have it, creative, sustainable, diverse, and young. Are these the new pillars of journalism? To help me answer this question, please help me introduce to the stage Moky Makura. She's Executive Director of Africa No Filter, a non-profit working on changing the narrative about Africa, and also the Editor-in-Chief of Bird Story Agency, a news agency that's set up specifically to offer stories that show a different perspective on Africa. Moky, welcome to the stage. It's also my pleasure to introduce Stefan Ludwig, who works at Corrective. They describe themselves as a public welfare-oriented media house that strengthens democracy. He also works in youth editorial office, in the youth editorial office called Salon 5, where he supports young people to raise their voices. So Stefan, please join us on stage. And last but not least, if you're on TikTok, you might have seen her. I am delighted to introduce my colleague, Johanna Rudiger, who is the head of social media strategy for Deutsche Welle's Culture and Documentaries Department. Now, in this role, she has a very tough job of ensuring that the department's social media channels engage with as many young people as possible. We'll know how successful she is in a short while. Johanna, join us. Thank you. All right, so given the data that you've just given us, Nick, which by the way makes me a little depressed because I feel terribly old now, for starters, but are we naive then in even framing this question like this, in believing that Gen Z are interested in a model of journalism that we have currently? Perhaps they want to completely dismantle it.
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear the views of other people on the panel, but I think, you know, what we found is that this generation is different, very different, and that social media has conditioned them. But obviously, as they grow up, they're also going to be interested in you know, getting a job or things that traditionally the media's also covered. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens and how this group develops. And the thing that gives me hope is, I think, you know, in talking to young people and listening to them, they're passionate about loads of different things. And I think sometimes traditional media companies are just missing this generation. You know, there's a gulf in understanding.
Yeah, but Moky, you're working consistently and directly with these young people from the continent of Africa, hosting the youngest population on Earth. What are the trends there?
Well, before I start, I actually want to know in this room, of the journalists here, who's under 30? Can we see show of hands? Okay, that's probably about maybe 20% of the room. And if you think about it, I think globally, it's something like over 50% of the world is under 30, but in Africa, it's something like 70%. I think your show is called 77%.
Please watch it on dw.com.
Free plug for you. You're welcome. I think the point I'm making is that actually newsrooms honestly don't reflect society right now. And what we are finding is that we are actually working with a lot of content creators. So, you know, Africa No Filter supports a lot of content creators in terms of telling stories about the continent. And we know we don't rely purely on journalists because a lot of the market that we are looking to influence don't necessarily listen to journalists. They listen to influencers. And one of the things that, one of our grantees, or somebody that we support, her name's Maria Mbulu. She's Tanzanian American. I think she's about 23. And she basically set up her own channel on TikTok because she said she was tired of the relentless bad news about Africa. So she has no real journalism experience or background. She's become a content creator. She has nearly 600,000 followers. She has views up to 8 million on some of her posts. And it's phenomenal. Yeah. You can't ignore people like that. The kind of influence she has, the kind of following she has, is more than some of the traditional, you know, news outlets on the continent. So, you know, that's the trend we're seeing. And just very quickly, in Bird, which is a story agency we set up to feed news outlets in Africa with less negative news about Africa, our newsroom has about 15 journalists in it, and apart from 3, they're all under 30. And the editor says that he prefers to work with younger journalists because they're natives. They intrinsically understand multimedia. They intrinsically understand how to put together content that they spend all their time watching. But the downside is they're less trained and there's slightly more effort in terms of processing their stories. So, you know, that's the downside, but I think also for us, it's, you know, sadly a lot cheaper.
Yeah, there's something to be said about people wanting to see themselves. And so, Stefan, I wonder, because newsrooms exist, they are organic. You can't just fire anybody who's over 30 and say that newsrooms will now be exclusively for young people. So how do we continue this journalism model while still having young people be represented in our productions?
I think it's important to get a voice for young people. So we have news for children and kids and maybe news for young adults. but at Salon 5 we work with teenagers, and I think that's a group which is missing in media, in news. And as you said, it's another definition of journalism and news, and we have to work with them to understand what they want to do.
Yes, and you're doing exactly that. Tell us a little bit about what you do at Salon 5.
We are in a young office, an editorial office, and the teenage reporters can do journalism at ours. So we are in the background, we try to show them how journalism works, how to research, what credible sources are, for example, and they come with the topics, and we support them to publish their own topics, their videos, their podcasts.
So how then are you able to do this on behalf of DW for TikTok and other social media outlets? The pain point is obviously how to maintain the tenets of journalism, the integrity, whilst documenting this for younger audiences.
Yeah, so I think Newman is absolutely right. Young people want their news told differently, and they want them on the platforms they're already on. So I started Deutsche Welle's very first TikTok account 4 years ago, and in 2020 there weren't many media houses on TikTok, so I didn't really have a lot of best practice examples to study. But I really wanted to learn how to reach young people on this new platform with our journalistic content. So I thought, okay, I'll just have to start my own account and then try out as many formats as possible, and then whatever works, implement at my job at Deutsche Welle. And so I didn't really start out, didn't try to be successful on my personal accounts, but I ended up building a really big community, and I learned so much from them. And what I learned is that it's all about, taking the news, breaking it down, and telling the people what it means for their daily lives, what this news we want to deliver means for their daily lives. But then also doing it sort of different delivery, doing it in more of an informal tone of voice, and not, talking at you, but talking with you. And I think at Deutsche Welle in our teams, we've gotten really good to sort of relentlessly research our topics very journalistically, but then we deliver the facts in a more informal tone of voice, in a very conversational tone, and really start a dialogue.
Yeah, but not every topic can be distributed in that way. And Nick, I remember you said in a previous interview that young people not only stay away from traditional news media, they actually see it as being detrimental to their personal health. So where is the space for hard news in this generation?
There is less space for it, but it's still really important. And we see this actually when you have big events happening. Young people, still come to traditional media when COVID happens, or when the invasion of Ukraine happens. We've seen that, and they consistently don't want the media to dumb down, but they do want it, as Johanna says, to be more informal and to change the tone that we take, to be more conversational. So I think there's a lot in tone. There's something in agenda we talked about, to broaden that agenda as far as possible. But I think the mistake that media should not make is to dumb down and not cover international conflicts, because young people, this is going to be relevant to young people's lives too.
Yeah. So the breaking news model, can we say, is that dead?
No, it's still a big part of it. In this year's report, we talk about user needs, and actually updating people on what's happening is still the top for most people. But these other things are underserved, right? Explaining the news, or giving people a broad range of perspectives, or giving people hope and inspiration. These are things that definitely young people are looking for, because they're going to live with the mess that we've left behind.
So because we're talking about solutions, Moky, you're on the other side of this. Africa No Filter has been funding people to tell these stories. What's been the impact of that investment?
Gosh, it sounds like one of my funders there.
Tell us.
Well, look, I think at the end of the day, what we understand is that the news that Africans are consuming about themselves is the same as Europeans, Americans are consuming. And it's got a negative impact on us as Africans, because this perception that we lack agency, that we don't have the means to, to create the change we want to see, it has very real ramifications for us as Africans. So what we do, and again, this is about us, we do have an agenda, and I think there's this thing about, news should be objective. We're objective, but our agenda is clear. We're trying to create balance, because much of the coverage around, Africa has been traditionally negative. It's events-driven, it's about conflict, and that's, it's kind of relentless coverage. coverage. And what we're doing is understanding the audience that we're serving and the fact, and Nick, you mentioned this in your report, that the variety of content they want to consume is different. Like one of the people we support, Zikoko Media in Nigeria, they put out the odd thing on breaking news, but it's really about reflecting what does their reader need. Their most popular series is on personal finance and how to make money. It's the things young people are interested in. And for us to be relevant and to change the narrative, you have got to understand your audience.
Understanding an audience, but also we're not talking about building community. Stefan, you've been able to do that somewhat. Have you been successful?
Building a community?
Yeah.
I think not, because our focus is not on the publishing, it's on the teenagers who are working for us at Salon 5. So I think it's a kind of education program to show them how journalism works. And of course, if the young people do the content by themselves, that is not that high standard quality level as studied journalists will do. So it's more kind of showing how journalism works, not reach millions of people.
Yeah, and so the word algorithm comes back into the conversation. How do you circumnavigate that to ensure that you're constantly top of your audience's mind on their feeds? How do you do it?
Well, I think the reason why we at Deutsche Welle are so successful actually at reaching our young target audience is because we decided really early on, we're going to go on these apps, we're going to go where our audience is at. And like I said, in 2020, we were one of the few media companies on TikTok, and now we have 15 TikTok accounts, or more than 15 actually. And so we did end up building a huge community on this Gen Z app that follows us for journalism. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we don't really have that problem that many other media companies do, that to attract young journalists in our newsrooms, because they know us, they consume our videos, and so they already know us from the apps we are on. And I think another reason why we don't have that problem is because we know Gen Z is really passionate about diversity, and Deutsche Welle is a very diverse company, and so they really appreciate that we take this topic really seriously.
Right, so are we saying the future of news is algorithm driven? Any takers?
It's many things. It's very complex. I actually think that, algorithms are here, right? Platforms are changing right now enormously. They're implementing different algorithms, so AI will play a bigger part in that. And we're not sure how that's going to affect young people or old people or our news consumption. But I do think that building relationships is the key, direct relationships, whether you do that off-platform through TikTok, through your personalities, but also directly through your own websites and apps and newsletters and podcasts, where you can really build something over time. And I actually think that's going to become more important over time for publishers. So it's clearly both. For this generation, you have to reach out where they are, but you also ultimately you're trying to bring them into a relationship where you can distinguish journalism from the massive information that is out there, some of which is extremely unreliable.
Right, because Moky did talk about content creation, when we're also talking about journalists coming into the fold. We wouldn't be doing this job forever. But automation is already shrinking the job market. Where are they going to get jobs from?
I think on the continent, we've been struggling with this, where are people going to get jobs? What I'm seeing, and what we know to be happening, is that most young people aren't looking for jobs on the continent. I think they've given up on that, I'll be quite honest. A lot of them are entrepreneurs. They're doing the gig economy. They're doing a little bit of Ubering here. They're doing some content creation here. And actually the trend that we have seen is that because some of the social media influencers are earning huge amounts of money. For example, there's Mark Angel in Nigeria, who's a comedian. I think he's got like 8 million, like a huge following. Apparently he's earned $4.2 million. That's the kind of aspiration they have. And they think they're setting up their own website, they're doing their own content creation, they feel they can earn money that way. Plus they're going into work sometimes every day, doing something. So I don't think there's this pressure to find a job, it's to get income. I think that's the trend that we're seeing. But I just want to be a little bit controversial here, because what we also know, and because Bird, the story agency that we support, serves 150 plus media outlets, we know that the people in in control, the people who have decision-making power in news outlets are still men, older men. They're the ones making the decision, and we see that with the data stories we put out, which aren't, the entertainment stories. They're the ones that get picked up because there's still this traditional idea that, people want this kind of news. But the entertainment news is sort of, just news that reflects me and my lifestyle. I think we need to kind of understand that, the people that are making decisions about news kind of needs to change, and certainly on the continent it needs to change.
Do we also then need to change, Stefan? I'm also curious. Because this narrative change, as you're saying, comes from within. Do we also need to change the stories then that we tell ourselves about young people in media? Because often we put them in a category of young, dumb, don't really understand socials.
I think so. As Johanna said, young people, I begin anew. I think it's important because young people are interested in politics, but maybe we just have to change the way we talk about it. So as the others said, it's not watching television news on 8 p.m. It's like watching on the mobile phone when TikTok or Instagram show it to me. And I think what another important thing is not to talk about young people, about teenagers, just talk with them. And I think that's an important point.
Yeah, excellent. And of course, one place we speak to young people on is social media platforms, and we've seen that Facebook popularity going down. Who knows what the future will be? And so our question is, which social media platform did you most recently join? You can scan the QR code and give us your answer. As you're doing that, I'd like to take one or two questions from the floor. Let's start with the gentleman there, the lady here, and if we have time, we'll take one more from this side. If possible, I would love to hear from those under 30.
They left the room.
You're under 30. We'll come back to you. Thank you. Audacious as ever.
Let me first apologize. I'm not under 30, and I'm not taking your position. My question is, in the study you conducted, these all-important young people will become the old people of tomorrow anyway. So when they get older, do they move on with this news consumption habit? The news consumption habit that they have now. So when they get older, do they move on with this the news consumption habit now? The reason I ask that is so that we know, and then we'll know how to move with them. Or do they throw away the consumption habit and probably adopt a different consumption habit now that probably aligns with older people?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nick?
Very briefly, they're not going to go back to buying a printed newspaper or watching television. They have, as the research shows, they have very different attitudes, and those attitudes are going to go with them. But at the same time, you have lifestyle effects and life change effects, which means that they will be interested in different things as they grow. So the answer is some kind of mix, but we can't hold on to, well, they'll come back to news as it used to be. That's not going to happen.
Yeah. Yes? Please wait for the microphone. It's right there.
I'll do it. Good morning. Hi, Smita Sharma here from India. And I've been in journalism for 21 years, also teaching young public policy students. I feel like a dinosaur after the conversation. But just to quickly follow up, Nick, does the study also suggest that the young people that we are talking about, the Gen Zs, are they also paying to watch news? Because in India, increasingly, the space for independent journalism is through paid subscriptions. So if they are not paying to watch news, there's one thing that you earn revenues through views. The other is when people are paying to actually consume news, that makes a difference. So should we really be oversimplifying news to cater to certain segments then?
I'd also like Stefan to follow up on that once Nick is done, because you also have a subscription model, right?
Yeah, I'll be brief. So broadly, young people aren't paying for news. They don't see the value in news. They don't see the relevance, all the stuff we've talked about. So that's not to say they never will if we can change some of the things that we do and connect in that way. The current model, which is absolutely reader payment, that's a generational time bomb. And most publishers you talk to It's the dirty secret that their average digital age of subscribers is sort of nearer 60. So, you know, they are digital, but they're not young. So this is a challenge, another challenge that we need to meet.
Correctiv is financed by donations and by foundations. And there are more people today who donate money for us, but I think not the young people yet.
Why aren't you donating the under 30? Let's hear your question.
To quickly introduce myself, my name is Aaliyah Sapphire, and I'm a 17-year-old from the US. I'm the current student publisher and a journalist at Harbingers Magazine, which is a project of the Oxford School for the Future of Journalism. It is a magazine, and it is online, entirely written, edited, managed, and published by Gen Z writers from the ages of 14 to 17 that undergo guidance from professional journalists while managing their own separate magazine. I feel that there are often conversations about Gen Z without completely and fully involving Gen Z, and my question to the panel is how to incorporate Gen Z into the field of journalism that makes them understand their equally important position in narrating and in the field.
Thank you for your question. Johanna, do you want to take that one?
Actually, we do have a lot of young creators at Deutsche Welle, so we constantly try to involve them, and we try to think up formats where we are not just talking about Gen Z, as mentioned before. We just did a couple of school series where African students were asking German student questions in the other way around, where no journalist was on screen, but the students were directly talking to each other. So we are always focusing on involving them as much as possible and not just do content for Gen Z, but do content with Gen Z and increase the dialogue. And I know Nick's report can be a bit depressing for traditional journalists if you're working for a website or a TV, but I do a lot of workshops for traditional journalists who want to transition into social media, and I feel like any journalist who wants to be successful on TikTok or Instagram and wants to learn can do that, because I always say the good news is that yes, we do go viral with good old journalism, as I call it, on these Gen Z platforms, because all the skills we already have as journalists that make us successful on other platforms, like researching a topic really well, fact-checking, storytelling, our breaking news ability, that also makes us successful on these platforms. We just really have to tweak our storytelling a little bit. We have to learn the language of the platform. We have to break it down. And yes, we do have to be more constructive in our journalism, because we have to tell the people why this news matters for their daily life, and we have to start a dialogue.
Thank you very much. I asked a question: which social media platform did you most recently join? The results are in. Okay, I don't even know some of these social media platforms. Be Real? What is that? I didn't even know about that.
Closed down. It's closed down, isn't it?
There's an app. There is one time a day counter, and when I say, okay, go, you have to take a picture of yourself and the other side.
Evidently, I'm not Gen Z. TikTok, Instagram, none, somebody says. I'm actually leaving. And Telegram. So, ladies and gentlemen.
Twitch.
And Twitch, yeah, Twitch is actually a very popular one. And by the way, we've been talking largely about Gen Z, but as the lady there said, she is actually Gen Alpha. I'm so sorry I can't take your question because we are out of time. But my panelists will be around, hopefully, and you can ask them your follow-up questions. Nick Newman, Moky Makura, Stefan Lufig, Johanna Rudiger, thank you for your time. To our audience,